In this one we're going to take a break from rolling stock and locomotives and have a look at some more signals while I'm gearing up to do what you've all been asking me to do, which is the junction signals wiring. It's going to take a little time, but I will get it done in the near future. We'll build two signals in this video, one being something that I bought by accident off eBay because it was misadvertised as being 00, but was actually O gauge, and a proper 00 gauge signal kit. But in that one I'm going to swap out the upper quadrant arm for a somersault arm, just to keep on the same playing field. Variation being, one's a lattice post and the other one is a concrete post. So the order of the day is Great Northern somersault signals, not to be confused with lower quadrant signals, which are, in my opinion, upside down normal signals. I'm sure there's going to be some entertaining arguments in the comments after that statement. Something else we'll be featuring is the wonderful work that Mink is doing over on Thingyverse. He draws stuff which he puts on the website, then you're able to download it and 3D print it. I've got 2 or 3 things that he's done that somebody else printed for me, which will eventually be episodes on this channel. And we're going to use his servo mount signal bases. And before anybody asks, no, I don't have a 3D printer. I'm not likely to have one. I get somebody to print them for me. If you ask me in the comments if I can print them for you, the reply will be some sort of emoji. More of that later. Because these kits are essentially all metal and mostly etched brass, we'll start off by cleaning everything, because that gives us a nice base for solder and paint. The downside of doing metal kits is it creates a lot of mess. So periodically throughout the build, I tend to clean my workspace with some white spirit and copious amounts of blue roll. On with the build, and we'll start with the posts. The smaller 00 scale concrete post is really easy to prep, but the O gauge lattice posts were, let's say, a massive pain in the backside. Probably because I thought it was going to be a half etched line all the way from top to bottom, but it wasn't. It was like 3 tabs. And every time I put the soldering on it, it bent and contorted all over the place with the heat. Thinking that doing 2 sides of a square was hard enough, joining those 2 halves together was even more difficult, and it seemed to take forever. I soldered a nut to a base plate that will help us attach it to our 3D printed mount later on. While I had the hot iron on, I thought I'd put the finial on the top, but it wasn't the final thing to go on. See what I did there? Because we've got stuff like this, which is the bracket to hold the actual signal arm on, which goes between 7 and 16 millimeters from the top, according to the instructions. In 4mm scale, that's 4 millimeters to 9 millimeters. Having soldered the arm that holds the signal arm onto the post, we'll see about the mechanism and how it all works. And before we even get going, I can tell you that whoever designed this thing was a sadistic mechanical genius. As you've just seen, the first thing I did was solder a rod, or a pivot rod, through the front of the signal arm, filed flush on the front and protruding about 10mm on the back side. To secure the arm in place, we're going to use the small washer provided and the use of a piece of paper to act as a gasket so none of the solder leaks through, and then hopefully solder that washer into place. What's going to take the next couple of minutes on this film to do actually took me probably a day and a half of modelling. It was time consuming and really fiddly, frustratingly so. I thought about buying one of those helping hands thing because I needed about 6. In the end, I decided for the sake of diversity, I'd get a lady finger. The rod that connects the lens and the signal arm, it's probably got a name all for itself. I don't know what it is. The length of which is critical to the operation of the whole signal. There is a part in the kit that is supposed to join the two, but I couldn't get it to work with that part. So I instead used a length of wire cut to the length that I could get it to work with. All held in with more little washers that were filed down to a flatter profile. The filming of this last section was done with the 7mm scale Guage signal. And if you think this was fiddly and time consuming, it had nothing on the 00 scale 4mm version. Anybody that does this sort of thing in N-gauge needs a bloody knighthood. All of what we've attached so far seems to be held into place by this back plate lens guard balance weight thing. We'll talk more about this in future episodes. Like I just said, it is associated with the lamp, which is the next thing to go on, but which I am not putting an actual light in, LED or bulb. And that statement stands for both the scales, Guage and 00. Happy with the way that the signal is operating from the top. Now time to link it to the bottom and the balance weight, which is always a little bit contentious because too many linkages and angles and pivot points in small scale can lead to disaster or a non-working signal. I had to cheat just a little bit by putting some little restraining clips or pieces of brass tube on the side of the signal to keep the operating wire in check so it doesn't keep bending all over the place. One thing that I end up doing quite a lot of is modifying kit parts. This build is no exception because the base plate is designed for round post signals, and we have just built a square lattice post and also a square concrete post. A minor inconvenience compared to everything else in this build. To say that the learning curve has been steep is probably an understatement. Before we go to paint, we'll chop a hole in the baseboard just to make sure that it fits. Measuring 38mm by 20, we'll mark that on the baseboard. Check to make sure there's nothing underneath, wires or rolling stock. I'm going to try out a new primer from Tamiya. Well, it's probably not new, it's just new to me. It's a rattle can, but unlike the Halford's primer that I have been using, it is remarkably controllable and a much finer spray. I left that to dry overnight and then painted everything white. Leaving that to dry overnight as well, I thought it was time to now add some colour. I'm going to try out this new one. Again, link in the description below. I was about to brush paint it on and then had second thoughts. Decided that I'd probably get a better finish if I masked up and put it through the airbrush. Knowing the end result, I think it was a good idea. Applied in 3 thin coats, leaving it about 5 minutes between each one, and it covered really well. With the masking removed, we can first test to make sure that we haven't gummed up all the moving parts, and then we can paint the furniture, the lens, light and ladder. At the beginning, I mentioned that I bought these kits off of eBay by mistake because they were misadvertised. I wasn't sure what to do with them once I realised that they were not 00 gauge. Whether that was return to sender, put them straight back on eBay, part exchange them for something else, or leave them in the kit stash for a rainy day. Well, that rainy day has arrived. They've been built, but I still don't know what to do with them. As you're probably well aware, I use the Mega Point system for controlling points and signals. The O-gauge signals that I've got temporarily hooked up to that system, tested, and they work fine. My double O-gauge signal installed onto the layout, and it also works very well. The only thing I've got left to do is to camouflage the base with the surrounding scenery, something that wouldn't need to be done if I would have done this before I'd done the scenery. But, you know, things. A suggestion from my mate Brian, who lives around the corner, was to put the O-gauge signals on my 00 layout. And at first, it doesn't seem that bad. It's only when you put an O-gauge engine next to them that it actually brings them into some sort of perspective. And it looks ridiculous, so it's not happening. They're going on eBay and they'll be sold via the model shop. There'll be options to have the servo mounts or not the servo mounts. They should be available in the next couple of days. That's all I have for you today. In the next week or so, I'm going to have another video out, which is going to be more of a vlog post thing. Yeah. There'll be a bit of modelling in it, but it's more of a blog post. Until then, thanks for watching. See you next time.